The brick chimneys of Lawrence, Massachusetts, exhaled thick plumes of slate-colored coal smoke into the frost of the 1920s, staining the Merrimack River with the grit of industrial triumph. In this city of booming textile looms, Ferdinand Waldo Demara Jr. entered the world surrounded by the trappings of sudden affluence. His father, a prosperous theater operator and real estate speculator, filled the family home with velvet draperies, brass fixtures, and the easy assumption of perpetual comfort. Young Ferdinand grew up accustomed to deference, watching his father command rooms with a single gesture. But when the Great Depression shattered the American economy, the Demara fortune evaporated almost overnight. The family was cast out from their stately home into the grim, cramped quarters of the city's working-class fringe. For young Ferdinand, this fall from grace was not merely a financial blow, it was a profound psychic wound. He looked upon the rigid social hierarchy of the world around him and recognized an intolerable truth: that society awarded prestige, power, and respect not to what a man inherently possessed within his soul, but to the paper credentials, uniforms, and titles he presented to the world. Demara possessed a mind unlike those of his peers. He was endowed with a formidable photographic memory, capable of scanning pages of complex text and retaining their structural logic, Latin terminology, and fine nuances after a single reading. Yet alongside this intellectual gift lay an utter contempt for the agonizingly slow cadence of formal schooling. The long years of examinations, apprenticeships, and bureaucratic drudgery felt like an insult to his boundless, restless ambition. At the age of 16, hungry for spiritual grandeur and absolute authority, he ran away from his family home to seek refuge behind the limestone walls of a Trappist monastery in Rhode Island. Within the silent cloisters, the young novice was enveloped by the scent of beeswax, old parchment, and incense. He threw himself into ascetic devotion, observing the strict rules of silence and physical labor. But the monastery's austere isolation could not long satisfy a spirit fueled by theatrical vanity. He soon discovered that the monastic life offered no stage upon which to perform. Over the next decade, Demara's life dissolved into a wandering sequence of radical reinventions. He slipped like a phantom through various religious orders, joining the Cistercians, the Brothers of Charity, and the Benedictines, each time departing when the rigid routines threatened to expose his volatile impatience or when the novelty of the habit wore off. When the Second World War engulfed the globe, Demara turned his attention toward the armed forces. In 1941, he enlisted in the United States Army, but the low status of a common recruit grated against his aristocratic delusions. He abruptly deserted, adopted the alias of a traveling religious scholar, and subsequently joined the United States Navy. Transferred to a medical station, he served as a hospital corpsman, absorbing the cadence of clinical speech, the handling of scalpels, and the fundamentals of wound care with astonishing speed. Yet even here, his ambition outstripped his station. Desperate to become a commissioned medical officer without the prerequisite university education, he forged credentials, applying for promotions with papers he had typed on stolen stationery. When naval investigators began sniffing around his suspicious background, Demara executed his first great theatrical escape. He drove to a deserted pier, parked his car, laid out his neatly folded uniform with a suicide note beside the cold waves, and walked away into the night under a brand new identity. In the late 1940s, the man who had officially drowned became Dr. Robert Linton French, an ordained clergyman and doctor of psychology. Armed with fabricated transcripts and letters of recommendation bearing stolen seals, Demara secured a position as an assistant professor of philosophy and psychology at Gannon College in Erie, Pennsylvania. Standing before lecture halls packed with veterans and eager undergraduates, Demara was a revelation. He was a mountain of a man 6 feet 2 inches tall, well over 200 pounds, with a booming baritone voice, wide, disarming eyes, and a magnetic, paternal charm that instantly disarmed skepticism. He lectured with sweeping eloquence, synthesizing texts he had memorized the previous evening. When colleagues asked deep theoretical questions, Demara deflected with brilliant humor or elevated the discourse into impenetrable theological abstraction, leaving his peers nodding in reluctant admiration. Yet the thrill of teaching was soon eclipsed by the constant fear of discovery. A casual background check by the Federal Bureau of Investigation regarding his wartime desertion eventually caught up with him. Demara served a brief prison sentence, but incarceration did nothing to extinguish his obsession with stolen lives. Upon his release, he emerged not reformed, but refined. He realized that the human race was astonishingly gullible. People saw only what they expected to see, trusting stamped papers, authoritative postures, and confidence far more than reality itself. By 1950, Demara had drifted north to the borderlands of Maine and the Canadian province of New Brunswick. In the quiet border town of Grand Falls, surrounded by vast fields of dark earth and dense spruce forests, he crossed paths with a gentle, soft-spoken local physician named Dr. Joseph Cyr. Dr. Cyr was a legitimate graduate of Laval University in Quebec, a hard-working French-Canadian doctor who had spent years laboring in rural obscurity. Modest to a fault and burdened by the exhausting demands of a provincial practice, Cyr held a quiet dream. He wished to cross the border and establish a medical practice in the United States, where opportunities seemed vast and lucrative. However, the labyrinth of American cross-border medical licensing, state board applications, and international immigration paperwork overwhelmed the timid practitioner. Sensing a golden opportunity, Demara approached Dr. Cyr under the guise of an influential academic and philanthropist. Posing as a worldly organizer dedicated to helping talented professionals advance their careers, Demara struck up a close friendship with the doctor. He visited Cyr's home, drank his tea, and listened intently as the physician unburdened his professional anxieties. Demara's warmth was intoxicating. He spoke of high-ranking contacts in American medical boards and assured Cyr that obtaining a license in Maine was a mere formality if the paperwork were handled with bureaucratic precision. Grateful for this unexpected patron, Dr. Joseph Cyr retrieved his most sacred personal documents from his desk. He handed Demara his medical diplomas, certified copies of his Laval University transcripts, letters of good standing from Canadian medical authorities, birth certificates, and official registration forms, trusting his new friend to package them for the United States authorities. Demara smiled, accepted the portfolio, and clasped the doctor's hand. He never mailed a single application on Cyr's behalf. Instead, Demara secluded himself in a rented room, surrounded by Cyr's authentic credentials. He studied the documents beneath the amber glow of a desk lamp, running his thick fingers over the embossed seals and Latin calligraphy. He memorized every date, every professor's name, every clinic where Cyr had trained. He practiced the rhythm of the name Joseph Cyr, medical doctor, until it felt as natural as his own breath. To Demara, these papers were not mere stolen property, they were an invitation into an elite, untouchable brotherhood. In the civilian world, Cyr was just a small-town physician, but in the military, an educated doctor was a prince among men. Across the Pacific Ocean, the Korean War had erupted into a brutal, meat-grinder conflict. Western nations, under the United Nations mandate, were scrambling to mobilize their armed forces. The Royal Canadian Navy was desperately short of qualified trauma surgeons and medical officers for its combat vessels deploying to the Far East. The Naval Administration had neither the time nor the inclination to conduct exhaustive, month-long forensic audits on candidates who produced pristine, certified paperwork from Laval University. Armed with Dr. Cyr's authentic credentials and an invented record of high-level clinical experience, Demara walked into the Royal Canadian Navy recruiting depot. His performance was flawless. He spoke with the measured cadence of a seasoned diagnostician, exuding calm, patrician authority. He explained that a deep patriotic fervor compelled him to leave private practice to serve the Crown in its hour of need. The naval recruiters were ecstatic. Rather than subjecting him to rigorous cross-examination, they welcomed him with open arms. Within weeks, Ferdinand Waldo Demara Jr. was officially commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy as a surgeon lieutenant. He was fitted for an officer's tailored uniform, complete with the gleaming gold lace and the distinctive red velvet cloth between the rank stripes that denoted a medical officer. He received his officer's sword, his commission document signed in the name of the King, and his official assignment, medical officer aboard the tribal-class destroyer HMCS Cayuga. In the damp, salt-laden chill of early 1951, Demara arrived at the naval docks of Halifax, Nova Scotia. The harbor was a forest of steel masts and churning gray water, alive with the screech of gulls and the thrum of idling marine turbines. Tied to the jetty, towering over the dockside crane, was the HMCS Cayuga, a warship built for battle, bristling with deck guns, torpedo mounts, and depth charge racks. Surgeon Lieutenant Joseph Cyr walked down the wooden pier, his heavy naval greatcoat snapping against his boots in the freezing Atlantic wind. In his leather doctor's bag lay not instruments of seasoned skill, but unopened manuals on military surgery and pharmacology. He looked up at the gray steel hull of the destroyer that was to carry him directly into the blood and fire of the Korean combat zone. With supreme posture, an unwavering gaze, and a steady pulse, the great impostor climbed the gangway and stepped aboard, entering the lioness den of his own creation. The steel deck of the Tribal-class destroyer shuddered beneath the soles of Demara's boots as twin steam turbines churned the harbor water into a froth of white foam. Lines were cast off from the Halifax docks, thick hemp ropes groaning against the bollards before splashing into the icy gray Atlantic. With a long, mournful blast of her horn, the HMCS Cayuga slipped away from the Canadian coast, setting her bow toward the western Pacific and the brutal winter of the Korean combat theater. Around him, officers in dark wool greatcoats moved with practiced, mechanical efficiency, barking commands that echoed down steel ladders and through narrow, paint-thick corridors. Demara stood on the weatherdeck, his chest expanding against the tailored wool of his officer's tunic, observing the receding shoreline of Nova Scotia. In his pocket lay the official identity card bearing the forged persona of Surgeon Lieutenant Joseph Cyr. To his left and right were veteran naval officers who had spent decades navigating the rigid hierarchies of king and country. He had arrived among them with nothing more than stolen transcripts, an insatiable hunger for consequence, and a terrifyingly absolute faith in his own intellect. When the destroyer hit the heavy swells of the open sea, the reality of Demara's isolation closed in with the weight of the ocean itself. He was assigned a modest private cabin in the officer's country, a claustrophobic cell of riveted steel plate, a fold-down desk, a narrow bunk, and a solitary incandescent bulb that swayed in rhythm with the ship's roll. Here, behind a locked door, the great masquerade ceased to be a social performance and became an agonizing war of intellectual endurance. Demara unpacked his sea chest. Inside were not souvenirs or family letters, but a formidable stack of medical textbooks, trauma manuals, and surgical guides purchased hurriedly in civilian bookstores before departure. He had never sliced human flesh with a scalpel. He had never administered a general anesthetic. He had never diagnosed an internal hemorrhage or set a compound bone fracture. Yet on this ship, carrying several hundred officers and ratings into an active combat zone, he was the sole medical authority. If a boiler exploded in the engine room or a shell from a North Korean coastal battery ripped through the mess deck, there was no senior surgeon to call, no civilian hospital over the horizon. There was only him. Beneath the amber cone of his desk lamp, Demara went to work. Possessed of an extraordinary, near-eidetic memory, he approached the vast literature of clinical medicine not as a student seeking gradual understanding, but as an actor consuming a script upon which his life depended. Night after night, while the ship plowed through the heavy sea lanes, he committed entire volumes to memory. He memorized anatomical cross-sections, the branching pathways of the femoral and carotid arteries, the tensile strength of catgut sutures, the dosages of morphine and atropine, and the precise mechanical leverage required to reduce a dislocated shoulder. He read with his fingertips, tracing the ink-drawn muscles and nerves, sub-vocalizing the Latin terminology until the names of human viscera flowed as effortlessly as the prayers he had once recited in New England monasteries. Yet Demara possessed a shrewd, instinctual understanding of human psychology that no textbook could teach. He knew that knowledge alone would not protect him. What an impostor needed above all else was an unassailable system of delegation and defense. When Demara first stepped into the Cayuga's sick bay, the scent of carbolic soap, methylated spirits, and damp canvas hit him. The medical compartment was small, compact, and gleaming with stainless steel counters and glass-fronted medicine cabinets. Waiting for him were the sick berth attendants, grizzled petty officers, and seasoned naval orderlies who had spent years bandaging burns, stitching lacerations, and treating tropical dysentery. A less perceptive fraud might have attempted to micromanage them, barking orders to prove his rank, and in doing so, inevitably exposed his utter ignorance of basic clinical routines. Demara did the exact opposite. He carried himself with the languid, patrician ease of a high society consultant who considered routine administration beneath his dignity. Gathering the medical staff together, Demara leaned against the examination table, his large, imposing frame radiating warm, fraternal benevolence. He looked the chief petty officer directly in the eye and delivered a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He explained that in civilian practice, he had come to realize that the backbone of any true medical operation was not the physician, but the experienced nursing staff. He stated plainly that he had no interest in standing over their shoulders or meddling in their day-to-day treatments of minor ailments, dressings, and sick call triage. "I believe in giving my men absolute autonomy," Demara told them, his deep, resonant voice calm and entirely convincing. "You run this sick bay as you know it should be run. You treat the common complaints, you manage the supplies, and you handle the routine procedures. If and only if you encounter a condition of unusual diagnostic complexity or an emergency requiring surgical intervention, you bring it directly to me." The attendants were stunned and deeply flattered. Accustomed to the haughty, tyrannical micromanagement common among newly commissioned medical officers, they immediately regarded Surgeon Lieutenant Cyr as the finest officer they had ever served under. By transferring the burden of daily medical practice onto men who actually knew how to clean wounds, administer injections, and dispense aspirin, Demara effectively insulated himself from the mundane tests that would have instantly shattered his cover. Whenever a sailor presented with an ailment that fell outside the attendant's scope, Demara deployed a brilliant delaying tactic. If a rating came to the sick bay complaining of strange abdominal cramps or severe joint pain, Demara would conduct a lengthy, solemn physical examination. He would press his stethoscope against the man's chest with profound gravity, furrow his brow in deep, scholarly contemplation, and nod slowly. A fascinating clinical picture, Demara would murmur, loud enough for the attendants to hear. "I want you resting in your bunk. Attendant, administer a standard analgesic, prepare a chart, and let the patient stabilize. I am going to retire to my quarters to cross-reference these symptoms with the latest literature on maritime pathology before I determine the precise regimen." Demara would then march back to his cabin, lock the door, throw open his diagnostic manuals, furiously cross-index the sailor's exact symptoms, and return 20 minutes later with a textbook-perfect treatment plan. To hedge against infectious catastrophe, Demara relied heavily on a miracle of modern wartime medicine, penicillin. The newly mass-produced antibiotic was his invisible shield. Whatever the wound, whatever the mysterious fever, Demara ordered generous, preventive courses of penicillin. By aggressively sterilizing wounds and drowning infections in antibiotics before they could take root, he allowed the human body's natural resilience to do the work of a seasoned physician. His social conquest of the ship was equally effortless. In the wardroom, Demara became the life of the office's mess. He was charming, unfailingly polite, and deeply attentive to the burdens of his peers. He formed a warm, respectful bond with the ship's commanding officer, Commander James Plummer. Plummer was a strict, dedicated naval officer who valued competence, quiet confidence, and morale above all else. In Demara, Plummer saw a brilliant young doctor who never complained about the bitter cold, never shirked his duties, and possessed an uncanny ability to lift the spirits of the entire ship with his infectious humor and gentle bedside manner. When minor dental emergencies arose during the voyage across the Pacific, Demara's legend only grew. A sailor presented with an impacted, agonizing molar that required immediate extraction. Demara had never held a pair of dental forceps in his life. Telling the patient that he needed to review the specific nerve topography of the lower jaw to ensure a painless procedure, Demara ducked into his cabin, stared intensely at an illustrated guide to local dental anesthesia and mandibular extraction for 4 minutes, and returned to the chair. With steady, unhesitating hands, he administered the Novocaine at the precise anatomical landmarks, applied the forceps with correct mechanical torque, and extracted the tooth cleanly without fracturing the root. The sailor was entirely pain-free, the ship's company was in awe. By the time the HMCS Cayuga arrived in the war-torn waters off the Korean peninsula, Surgeon Lieutenant Joseph Cyr was widely regarded as one of the most capable, dedicated, and beloved medical officers in the entire Canadian naval contingent. The ship was thrust into the grim, high-stakes operational rhythm of the Yellow Sea. The destroyer operated in treacherous, shallow coastal waterways, dodging hidden sandbanks and floating mines to bombard enemy shore batteries, screen aircraft carriers, and provide close fire support for clandestine amphibious commando raids behind enemy lines. The air was frigid, the gray sky perpetually choked with low-hanging sleet and the acrid stench of spent cordite. The psychological game Demara was playing had reached its absolute zenith. He had successfully bluffed his way across 6,000 miles of ocean, he had extracted teeth, diagnosed fevers, prescribed regimens, and charmed the highest-ranking officers in the fleet. But deep down, beneath the velvet-trimmed officer's uniform and the calm exterior, Demara knew that the easy part of the deception was over. Out here, along the jagged coastline of a burning nation, the sea did not deal in toothaches and common colds. The reckoning arrived without warning on a gray, freezing afternoon. The Cayuga's combat communications crackled into life with a flurry of urgent, high-priority transmissions. A combined force of South Korean guerrillas and allied irregulars had executed a ferocious amphibious raid against an entrenched North Korean position on a nearby coastal island. The raid had achieved its objective, but at an appalling human cost. A naval landing craft was currently cutting through the freezing chop toward the Cayuga, carrying 16 severely mangled casualties. The voice of the deck officer blared through the ship's tannoy system, the metallic echo cutting through the hum of the engines. "Sick bay party, prepare for incoming trauma casualties." All hands to emergency stations. Doctor to the sick bay immediately. Demara stood motionless in the narrow corridor for a fraction of a second, the emergency lighting casting long, trembling shadows across his face. The bluff was over. Men with shattered bones, torn arteries, and shrapnel-filled chests were about to be lifted over the ship's rail. There was no textbook he could read in 20 minutes that could substitute for the blood-soaked reality of a triage station. The great impostor took a deep breath, adjusted his officer's cap, and walked steadily toward the operating table. The deck of HMCS Cayuga shuddered beneath the impact of landing craft bouncing against the destroyer's steel hull, the freezing mist of the yellow sea whipping across the open gangways. Through the sleet and the sulphurous haze of the ship's exhaust, the first stretchers emerge. 16 men lay broken beneath blood-soaked canvas blankets, South Korean guerrillas whose bodies had absorbed the savage brunt of mortar bursts, shrapnel, and close-range machine gun fire during the raid. The stench that rushed into the narrow companionways was instantaneous and suffocating, the copper tang of hemorrhaging arterial blood, the foul rot of perforated bowels, charred flesh, and the sour, freezing mud of the Korean coast. Groans in a foreign tongue reverberated off the bulkheads, mingling with the urgent shouts of sailors hauling the stretchers down the steep ladders toward the sick bay. Demara stood at the threshold of the medical compartment, the stark white glare of the overhead surgical lamps washing over his broad silhouette. His pulse hammered violently against his temples, but his exterior remained an unyielding wall of stoic authority. Looking directly at his lead sick bay attendant, Demara issued his orders with a calm, resonant voice that brooked no hesitation. He commanded the attendants to immediately triage the casualties, strip away the frozen, ruined uniforms, administer heavy doses of morphine to manage traumatic shock, and pump massive, preemptive units of crystalline penicillin into every wounded man. Then, with an effortless air of clinical detachment, he announced that he would retreat to his quarters for precisely 5 minutes to prepare his mind and review the surgical itinerary. Inside his cabin, Demara turned the lock. The illusion of tranquility vanished the moment the brass bolt clicked into place. Cold sweat broke across his forehead as he lunged toward his shelf of medical manuals. His fingers ripped open the pages of an illustrated military treatise on operative trauma surgery and chest wounds. His extraordinary mind, an immaculate, visual ledger capable of recording and indexing complex schematics in mere seconds, went to work under pure, primal adrenaline. He devoured the cross-sectional diagrams of the human thorax, the intercostal arteries, the delicate pleural lining, the precise trajectory of the vagus nerve, the clamping of severed vessels, and the mechanical leverage required to retract rib cages. He traced the lines of muscle fascia with his thumb, imprinting the layered geometry of human tissue into his memory like an architectural blueprint. Closing the volume with a dull thud, he closed his eyes, visualized the instruments in his surgical tray, took one deep, stabilizing breath, and unlocked the door. When Surgeon Lieutenant Cyr stepped into the cramped, sweltering theater of the sick bay, the chaos had reached a fever pitch. Attendants were swabbing pooling blood from the linoleum deck, while wounded men lay on operating tables and makeshift litters along the corridor. Demara rolled up his sleeves, scrubbed his hands in carbolic wash until his skin burned, and allowed an orderly to tie the sterile white mask across his face. The initial procedures were a test of sheer nerve and mechanical mimicry. He sutured deep, jagged shrapnel lacerations with the neat precision of a tailor, debrided dead, blackened muscle tissue, and set compound fractures with swift, decisive adjustments of the bone. When faced with a mangled foot threatening systemic gangrene, he recalled the exact bone saw techniques and arterial tourniquets he had memorized hours earlier, performing an amputation with clean margins and tying off bleeding vessels before the patient could succumb to blood loss. Throughout every incision, he relied on the modern miracle of penicillin, flooding the open wounds with antibacterial washes to compensate for any technical clumsiness. Then, the true crucible of the night was wheeled onto the main operating table. The casualty was a young Korean guerrilla, barely 20 years old, his skin gray and clammy, his breathing shallow and rattling. A high-velocity rifle bullet had entered his upper chest, tearing through the pectoral muscle and lodging deep within the thoracic cavity, mere millimeters from the pericardial sac surrounding his heart. The attendants stood motionless, their eyes wide above their surgical masks, terrified that the slightest movement would puncture a major vessel and end the young man's life on the table. Demara knew that hesitation would betray him. He asked for the scalpel. The ship swayed gently in the coastal swell, the dull vibration of the engines humming through the soles of his boots. Demara pressed the cold steel of the blade into the young man's flesh, tracing a deliberate incision along the intercostal space. Blood welled up instantly, obscuring the field, but Demara did not flinch. he ordered the suction tube positioned, clamped the weeping bleeders with hemostatic forceps precisely where his photographic memory told him the vessels ran, and inserted the rib spreaders. As the mechanical arms of the retractor cranked open the chest wall, the internal anatomy of a living human being was laid bare beneath the harsh lamps. There, pulsating with every frantic, fragile beat of the heart, lay the jagged, leaden slug. It sat directly adjacent to the pericardium, vibrating in rhythm with the organ-esque contractions. A heavy, suffocating silence gripped the sick bay. The only sound in the room was the hiss of the oxygen cylinder and the rhythmic clink of metal instruments. Demara's hands, encased in thin rubber gloves, were entirely steady. He called for curved forceps. Leaning over the open chest, feeling the radiating warmth of the patient's exposed vital core, he navigated the narrow passage between the lung tissue and the cardiac wall. With agonizing slowness, millimeter by millimeter, he slipped the tips of the instrument around the metallic foreign body. He gripped the slug. The heart fluttered beneath his knuckles. Demara waded through one systolic pulse, synchronized his movement with the muscle's relaxation, and gently eased the bullet free from the surrounding tissue. A collective, shuddering exhalation swept through the attendants. Demara dropped the bloody piece of lead into a metal kidney dish with a sharp, echoing ring. He immediately packed the cavity, inserted a chest drain to prevent a tension pneumothorax, and closed the pleural layers and skin with tight, flawless sutures. The marathon of surgery continued through the night, stretching across 16 uninterrupted hours of slicing, suturing, setting, and irrigating. By the time the gray light of dawn crept through the portholes of the Cayuga, illuminating the cold, slate-colored waters of the Yellow Sea, the battle in the sick bay was over. 16 men had entered the ship on the brink of death. Against every statistical probability and medical reality, all 16 were alive, their vital signs stabilizing beneath blankets and continuous intravenous drips. Not a single casualty had perished under the hands of the unlicensed, self-taught surgeon. When Commander James Plummer came down the ladder to inspect the sick bay, he found his medical officer sitting slumped on an ammunition crate in the corridor, drenched in sweat, his surgical gown soaked in dried blood, his eyes bloodshot with profound exhaustion. Plummer looked upon Demara not merely as an officer, but as a miracle worker, a hero of the Royal Canadian Navy who had performed impossible feats of battlefield surgery under the most harrowing operational conditions imaginable. Plummer immediately drafted a series of glowing dispatches to Naval Headquarters in Ottawa, detailing the extraordinary skill, unflinching courage, and surgical brilliance of Surgeon Lieutenant Joseph Cyr. The Public Relations Department of the Canadian military, eager for positive wartime news to bolster domestic morale during the grinding Korean campaign, seized upon the story with unbridled enthusiasm. Within weeks, the heroic exploits of the Cayuga's surgeon were distributed across the North American continent. Newspapers from Vancouver to Halifax, and across the wire services into the United States, published lavish feature articles recounting the dramatic night in the Yellow Sea. Above the breathless headlines praising the savior of the wounded guerrillas sat a crisp, clear, high-contrast portrait of the officer. A smiling, heavy-set man with thick dark hair, wearing the double-breasted uniform and braided shoulder boards of a Canadian naval surgeon. Several thousand miles away, in the quiet, snow-dusted province of Quebec, the morning newspaper was delivered to the home of Mrs. sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of hot tea. The elderly woman unfolded the broadsheet, her eyes drawn to a prominent headline celebrating the international heroism of a native son. A proud smile touched her lips, but as her gaze drifted downward to the accompanying photograph, the smile froze and dissolved into profound bewilderment. The name printed in bold black ink was undoubtedly that of her son. The medical degree from Université Laval, the hometown, the biographical details all belonged to her boy, the quiet, practicing physician currently living his ordinary life in Grand Falls. But the face staring back at her from the front page was completely, undeniably alien. The man in the naval uniform was a towering, thick-necked stranger she had never seen in her life. Deeply alarmed, Mrs. Cyr contacted her son. The real Dr. Joseph Cyr looked at the newspaper with mounting horror, recognizing the stolen ghost of his own life staring back at him from the war zone. He immediately contacted the authorities. The wheels of military intelligence turned with swift, silent lethality. Encrypted, high-priority cables bypassed the ordinary chains of naval command and were beamed directly across the Pacific to the command staff of the Canadian flotilla. Aboard the HMCS Cayuga, resting at anchor in a coastal inlet, the surreal calm was broken by a sudden knock on the cabin door. Demara looked up from his desk to find a delegation of grim-faced naval officers and investigators standing in the narrow passageway. They stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind them. The senior officer did not raise his voice, but the words carried the weight of an absolute, shattering finality. He laid a copy of the Canadian newspaper onto Demara's desk, alongside the official police file from Quebec and a set of fingerprints. The masquerade that had conquered oceans, fooled admirals, and defied the mortal threshold of the operating theater had finally collapsed beneath the weight of its own fame. Surgeon Lieutenant Joseph Cyr was no more. Demara looked at the newsprint, then back up at the officers, the charismatic charm slowly fading into a quiet, resigned stillness. The great impostor offered no resistance as they took his naval insignia, placed him under formal cabin arrest, and prepared to quietly remove him from the ship he had so spectacularly deceived. The iron hatch of the destroyer swung shut with a hollow, resonant clang, sealing Ferdinand Demara within the confines of his cabin while the Canadian Naval Command grappled with an unprecedented bureaucratic nightmare. In the quiet, wood-paneled offices of Naval Headquarters in Ottawa, admirals and government ministers reviewed the classified dispatches in stunned, mortified silence. The legal reality was staggering. The man who had performed flawless trauma surgery in the Yellow Sea, who had earned the unreserved devotion of Captain James Plummer and the crew of the HMCS Cayuga, was an American high school dropout with a trail of stolen names stretching across 2 nations. Yet, beneath the shock lay an acute institutional terror. To bring Demara before a public court-martial would mean acknowledging to the global press, the Canadian electorate, and allied military commands that an untrained drifter had waltzed through their most rigorous security vetting, claimed a Surgeon's commission, and operated on combat casualties without anyone noticing. Furthermore, there was the agonizing paradox of his success. Demara had not botched a single procedure, he had not killed a patient, stolen money from the ship as safe, or committed sabotage. In the eyes of the public and the men whose lives he had preserved, he was a miracle worker. To prosecute him for practicing medicine without a license would risk transforming the Navy into an international laughingstock while casting the impostor as a persecuted folk hero. The High Command chose the path of least resistance. In the damp chill of an early morning in 1952, Demara was escorted down the steel gangway of the Cayuga under heavy guard, stripped of his uniform, and placed onto a southbound train. No formal charges were filed, no tribunal was convened, and no public statement was issued. The Royal Canadian Navy quietly refunded his back pay, revoked his fraudulent commission, and deposited him at the United States border with a stern admonition never to return. The military establishment hoped that by expelling the ghost, the memory of his impossible masquerade would simply evaporate into the fog of history. They could not have been more mistaken. Demara did not slink into the shadows of obscurity. Instead, he stepped boldly into the glare of the American media spotlight. The silence of the Canadian authorities could not contain the sensational nature of the story, and within months, rumors of the surgeon who was never a doctor leaked into the American press. Sensing an opportunity to turn notoriety into financial survival, Demara approached Life magazine, selling the rights to his astonishing autobiography for several $1,000s. In February 1952, millions of American households opened the magazine to find Demara's large, smiling face plastered across a multi-page spread entitled The Great Impostor. Rather than viewing his exploits with moral outrage, the post-war public was utterly captivated. In an era increasingly defined by corporate conformity, rigid social hierarchies, and the cold tyranny of academic credentials, Demara represented a mischievous, mythic rebellion. He had proven that ordinary human beings were often imprisoned not by their lack of inherent ability, but by the artificial gates erected by institutions. The sensational article caught the attention of the American journalist and author Robert Crichton, who spent months interviewing the chameleon to piece together the labyrinth of his psychological motives. In 1959, Crichton published The Great Impostor, a searing, deeply psychological biography that rapidly climbed the national bestseller lists. The book stripped away the romantic veneer to reveal a man possessed by an insatiable, almost pathological hunger for purpose, a genius who suffered from the terrible burden of having no authentic self to anchor his extraordinary talents. Hollywood soon came calling, transforming the book into a major 1961 feature film starring Tony Curtis. The American drifter from Lawrence, Massachusetts, had achieved the ultimate modern transcendence. His fictionalized self had become larger than reality itself. Yet, fame proved to be Demara's greatest curse. A master of deception requires anonymity the way a fire requires oxygen. Global recognition effectively destroyed the invisible cloak behind which he had operated for over a decade. He was now recognized on street corners, in diners, and in hotel lobbies. Whenever he tried to live an honest life as Fred Demara, the crushing banality of ordinary labor suffocated him. He had tasted the intoxicating nectar of supreme command, the life and death gravity of the operating theater, the sacred authority of the monastery, and the intellectual prestige of the academic podium. Working a 9-to-5 job as an uncredentialed ed laborer felt like a living death. Inevitably, the compulsive urge to shed his skin returned. In 1955, despite his face having appeared in national magazines, Demara vanished once more. Adopting the alias of Ben W. Jones, he applied for a position with the Texas Department of Corrections. Drawing upon his profound intuitive grasp of institutional psychology and human behavior, he secured an appointment as an assistant warden at the maximum security Eastham unit in Huntsville, Texas, one of the most notoriously brutal and violent prison facilities in the United States. Where armed guards and heavy iron bars had bred riots and despair, Demara introduced a regime of psychological control and radical reform. He walked unarmed among the most dangerous convicted murderers, establishing a system of prisoner self-governance and behavioral incentives that astonished his superiors. For months, the Texas Prison Board praised Ben W. Jones as a visionary penologist destined to revolutionize the American penal system. The illusion held until a literate inmate, flipping through an old issue of Life magazine in the prison library, paused at the photograph of the legendary Impostor. The prisoner looked up, stared at the assistant warden standing across the room, and the masquerade shattered once again. When state officials moved to question him, Demara calmly packed his single suitcase, slipped through the prison gates under the cover of darkness, and vanished into the night before warrants could be drawn. Over the next 2 decades, his life became a perpetual, nomadic cycle of breathtaking ascents and sudden, panicked flights. He surfaced in Maine as an inspiring high school teacher of Latin and English, beloved by his students for his dramatic pedagogical style, only to flee when a visiting state inspector recognized his voice. He secured a post as a dean of philosophy at a small Catholic college, relying entirely on his photographic recall of classical texts to lecture graduate students. He took orders as a Baptist minister in the American Northwest, delivering sermons of such profound emotional resonance that parishioners wept in the pews, entirely unaware that the man blessing their children was a fugitive from the law. Demara had refined his methodology into what he called his 2 fundamental rules of human nature. The first rule was that in any human organization, there is always an enormous, unfilled vacuum of authority. If a person steps into that void with complete self-assurance, no one will ever challenge them. The second rule was that humanity inherently trusts paper over substance. If a man carries an official title and speaks with the cadence of institutional authority, people will actively ignore their own common sense to preserve their belief in the system. As the decades slipped away, the physical and emotional toll of living dozens of simultaneous lives began to consume him. The sheer intellectual strain of constantly monitoring his own speech, of remembering which childhood, which degree, and which accent belonged to which identity, eroded his nervous system. In the 1970s, suffering from severe diabetes and chronic circulatory failure, Demara finally abandoned the art of the mask. He settled in Orange County, California, living under his true name, Ferdinand Waldo Demara Jr. Unable to secure medical licensing and weary of the deceit, he was legitimately ordained as a visiting counselor and chaplain at the Good Samaritan Hospital of Orange. In those quiet, sterile corridors, smelling of antiseptic and dim fluorescent light, the great Impostor spent his final years providing spiritual solace to the dying. He sat beside the beds of terminal patients, holding their hands in the darkness, offering comfort not through the stolen prestige of a medical degree, but through the hard-won, empathetic understanding of a man who had traversed the deepest chasms of human vulnerability. When hospital staff occasionally recognized him from old cinema posters or yellowed newspaper clippings, he simply smiled, offered a soft word of blessings, and returned to his prayers. In June 1982, at the age of 60, Demara died quietly in a modest trailer park in Anaheim, his heart finally succumbing to the ailments that had confined him to a wheelchair in his final months. He left behind no wealth, no family, and no material estate, only a sprawling, bewildering dossier of stolen lives that continued to defy the categories of modern sociology and criminology. The historical verdict on Ferdinand Demara remains an enduring philosophical enigma. Was he a cynical, sociopathic fraudster who exploited the naive trust of a society that desperately wanted to believe in heroes? Was he merely an audacious opportunist blessed with an improbable streak of blind luck that carried him through mortal danger without consequence? Or was he an unheralded, tragic genius who exposed the fundamental frailties of modern human credentialism? The reality lies in the complex space where those questions intersect. Demara possessed an intellectual capacity that could easily have earned him legitimate greatness in half a dozen academic and professional disciplines, yet he lacked the psychological patience to endure the slow, mundane machinery of institutional progression. He sought not wealth, for he never stole money, embezzled funds, or sought material luxury, but rather the intoxicating sensation of being useful, admired, and necessary. In doing so, he held up a mirror to the modern world, proving that society frequently values the diploma over the intellect, the uniform over the courage, and the illusion of expertise over the raw, terrifying brilliance of the human mind. He lived 100 different lives, touched thousands of souls, and conquered the highest fortresses of authority, remaining to the very end a man who could become anyone in the world except himself.